mutations are the raw materials for evolution, right? He said that mutations are the raw materials for evolution, right? And in the second postulate, he's telling that all mutations are said to be, they usually occur all of a sudden. So mutations occur all of a sudden. So this is the second postulate which was given by Hugo de Vries pertaining to the process of evolution. Number one, mutations are the raw materials for evolution. Number two, mutations occur all of a sudden. So the third postulate which was given by Hugo de Vries pertaining to the mutation theory is, he said that mutations are all said to be full-fledged. Right? So mutations are full-fledged. Right? So what does this mean? Mutations are full-fledged. What he meant by this particular term, telling that mutations are full-fledged, is there is no intermediate stage. Right? So there is no intermediate stage during the course of evolution, right? So there is no intermediate stage during the course of evolution, right? So he said that mutations are all said to be full-fledged and there is no intermediate stage during the course of evolution, right? So three important postulates we have seen so far. One is, he said that mutations are considered as the raw materials for evolution. Second one, mutations occur all of a sudden in a particular organism. That's how we started defining mutation as, right? So we define mutation as what? A sudden, random, heritable change. So he said that mutations occur all of a sudden. The third one, what he said was, mutations are said to be full-fledged. That is, there is no intermediate stages, right? So there is no intermediate stages during the course of evolution. So these are the three important postulates what he said. So in continuation with this, he started saying that all mutations are said to be inheritable, right? So all mutations are inheritable, right? So this is the next point what he said, or the next postulate what he said. He started saying that all mutations are said to be inheritable, right? So that is, it could be transmitted from generation to generation. Once there is some sort of a mutation in an organism, right? So those mutations would now be transmitted from one generation to the other generation, saying that all mutations are said to be inheritable mutation. Right. The next one, the fifth point what he mentioned was, beneficial mutations are selected by the nature, Again, he started to incorporate the theory of natural selection which was given by Darwin. So what he said was, all beneficial mutations are said to be selected by the nature, whereas all sort of harmful or lethal mutations are said to be eliminated. Right? So this is the fifth postulate what he said. So what was the fifth postulate he said? He said that all beneficial mutations are said to be selected by the nature, whereas harmful or lethal mutations are said to be eliminated by the nature. So this is the next point what we had made, right? So the first postulate which was given by Hugo de Vries is, mutations are said to be raw materials for the process of evolution. Second one, mutations occur all of a sudden. The third one, all mutations are said to be full-fledged. That is, there is no intermediate stage during the course of evolution. Then all mutations are said to be inheritable. That is, they are transmitted from generation to generation. And the fifth one, what he said is, beneficial mutations are alone selected by the nature. Again, the theory of natural selection comes in here, right? So organisms possessing the beneficial mutations, they alone are selected by the nature, whereas all harmful and lethal mutations are said to be eliminated from the population, right? So this is what he said. Now moving on to number 6, right? So the sixth postulate what he said was accumulation of variations of variations would lead to speciation. Right? So accumulation of variation would lead to speciation. Right? So what does speciation mean? Speciation is nothing but evolution of a new species is called as speciation. So what he said is accumulation of variations would lead to speciation, just like what Darwin also had said. Right? So Darwin also said the same thing. Accumulation of variations in a particular organism would lead to the evolution of a new species. So De Vries is also saying the same thing in his sixth postulate. He's telling that accumulation of variations would lead to the evolution of a new species. And he also adds telling that sometimes, right, sometimes a single mutation would be sufficient for the process of speciation. Right? So sometimes a single mutation, right? Sometimes a single mutation would be sufficient for the process of speciation, right? So this is what he tries to tell in his sixth postulate. Usually, accumulation of variations, that is beneficial variations, would lead to the evolution of a new species. But sometimes even a single mutation would be sufficient for the evolution of a new species. So he starts giving a few examples. So we'll see that examples once we are done with all of the postulates. Right? So this is the sixth postulate which was given by Hugo de Vries pertaining to the theory of mutation. Right? And then talking about the last point, right? So the last point, I'll just write it down here. Right? So the sixth point, what he says, sorry, the seventh postulate, what he says is, he says that all mutations are said to be random. Right? So since mutations are random, that is directionless, even the process of evolution also, so even the process of evolution is also said to be random, that is directionless. So this is the seventh postulate which was given by Hugo de Vries. Right? He says that since mutations are said to be random, that is they are directionless, the process of evolution also is said to be random. It is also said to be directional. So these are the postulates which were actually given by Hugo de Vries pertaining to the theory of evolution, and all of these postulates which was given by Hugo de Vries was written in his book by name The Mutation Theory. Right? So quickly going through each of these points once again. The first postulate, he said that mutations are the raw materials for evolution. First one. So what he's trying to say is without mutations there is no evolution possible. Right? So without mutation there is no evolution. The second thing what he tries to say is mutations occur all of a sudden. So that's how we usually define the term mutation. Right? So how do we define mutation? Mutations are nothing but sudden, random, inheritable changes that occur in an organism. So he said that mutations occur all of a sudden. The second postulate. The third postulate, what he said is mutations are said to be full-fledged, or we can put it this way. The process of evolution is said to be full-fledged. So what does that mean, full-fledged? There is no intermediate stages during the course of evolution. Right? There is no intermediate stages during the course of evolution. Just like what we have saw, right? When we were discussing about the evidences for evolution, right? When we were talking about the evidence regarding comparative anatomy, we spoke about something called as connecting links, right? So connecting links shows us that evolution is a continuous process, because the connecting link will have the characters of two different groups of organisms. So that shows that evolution is a continuous process. But what Hugo de Vries says in his mutation theory is evolution is not a continuous process. It is a full-fledged process because there is no intermediate stage involved during the course of evolution. That is the third postulate. The fourth postulate, he says, all mutations are said to be inheritable. That is, mutations, once they occur in an organism, so those mutations would be transmitted from generation to generation. Therefore, they are all said to be inheritable. The fifth one, what he says is, beneficial mutations are alone selected by the nature. So he says beneficial mutations are selected by the nature. Another theory which was actually given by Darwin pertaining to the theory of natural selection. So Darwin also said that beneficial variations are the ones which are selected by the nature in his theory called as the natural selection. So the same type of postulate is being incorporated here also, telling that beneficial mutations are alone selected by the nature, whereas harmful mutations are eliminated from the population. The next postulate is accumulation of variations would actually lead to speciation. This was again told by Darwin, but Hugo de Vries adds on another point saying that even a single mutation would sometime lead to the evolution of a new species. That is, it would lead to a process called as speciation. So this is the sixth postulate. And the last postulate, what he says is mutations are random. Since mutations are random, the process of evolution also is said to be a random process. So it is not a directed process. It is a random process, right? So these are the postulates which was actually given by Hugo de Vries in his theory called the mutation theory, right? So he came up with some examples pertaining to this particular theory, right? So let us take up those examples, a few examples with regards to this particular mutation theory, right? So the first example, what he spoke about is actually called as the Ancon sheep, right? So this is the first example what he spoke about, right? So this Ancon sheep is a new variety, a new species with shorter legs, right? So this organism has shorter leg, not the regular sheep variety. So the legs of this organism is actually said to be shorter than that of the normal sheep. So it is called as the Ancon variety. So the Ancon sheep, right? So evolution of this particular organism was again due to mutation. That's what Hugo de Vries says. One more example is hornless cattle. Hornless cattle, right? So the cattle without horns, right? Hornless cattle is again another example. So what Hugo de Vries says is the evolution of hornless cattle is mostly because of mutation. We know that all cattle have horns, but the evolution of hornless cattle is again because of mutation. He talks about one more example, which is a dwarf variety of wheat. Dwarf wheat is one example what he says, right? A dwarf variety of wheat is also considered as an example for mutation. And one more is dwarf rice variety, right? So this is also considered as a mutant variety, right? Which is again evolved because of some sort of mutations in those particular organisms, right? So these are some of the examples what Hugo de Vries gives us to explain his particular theory called the mutation theory, right? So one of the objections of Darwin, so if you could recollect, yesterday we were talking about the objections of Darwin, right? So the first and foremost objection of Darwin was what? He could not explain the origin of variation. That's what we have seen, right? So scientists said that Darwin could explain about the survival of the fittest, but he could not give any sort of explanation regarding arrival of the fittest. So that objection was actually solved by mutation theory, which was given by Hugo de Vries. So Hugo de Vries spoke about how variations would have risen in a particular organism. And he says that the major cause of variations in a particular organism is because of these mutations that have taken place in an organism. Right? So this is what we have with the third theory, which is called as the mutation theory pertaining to the process of evolution, which was given by Hugo de Vries. Right? I hope this theory is clear. So three theories we have done till now, right? One is Lamarck's theory, the second one Darwin's theory, and the third one is Hugo de Vries' mutation theory. Right? So let's now take up with the last theory what we have in the list, right? So the last theory pertaining to the process of evolution, which is called as the modern synthetic theory, or it is also called as Neo-Darwinism. Excuse me, right? It is called as modern synthetic theory, or it is also called as Neo-Darwinism. So let's take up with that particular theory, the last theory pertaining to the process of evolution. So let us see what scientists have said in that particular theory, right? So the modern synthetic theory or the Neo-Darwinism. modern synthetic theory or Neo-Darwinism. Right? So this is actually the theory which is accepted by most of the scientists, right? So the modern synthetic theory or the Neo-Darwinism, right? Either the modern synthetic theory or the Neo-Darwinism, right? Now, due to the work of several scientists, right? So due to the work of several scientists, scientists were able to get a clear picture pertaining to the origin of variations as well as the inheritance of these variations, right? So due to the work of certain prominent scientists, right? Due to the work of certain prominent scientists, evolutionary biologists were able to get a lot of details, a lot of understanding pertaining to how the variations originated and also how these variations were inherited from generation to generation, right? So some of the theories like the germplasm theory, right? So some of the theories like the germplasm theory. Remember the germplasm theory, what we took up the other day, right? So who was the scientist who came up with this theory? It was August Weismann. So the germplasm theory of Weismann, right? Similarly, the mutation theory, right? The mutation theory given by, we just saw that, Hugo de Vries, as well as the laws of inheritance. So who came up with this laws of inheritance? Our own scientist by name Mendel. Right? So these three scientists, as well as the works of these three scientists, that is the germplasm theory which was given by August Weismann, mutation theory given by Hugo de Vries, and the laws of inheritance given by Mendel. Right. So these three theories, with the help of these three theories, scientists were able to get, that is evolutionary biologists, were able to get a clear picture based on the origin of variations as well as the inheritance of these particular variations. Right. So once scientists have obtained some sort of idea pertaining to this process of evolution, that is origin of variations as well as the inheritance of variation, some of the scientists, right? Some of the scientists like Haeckel, right? And other scientists such as Huxley, right? And again, another scientist by name Simpson, right? Simpson. So these three scientists were actually considered as the followers of Darwin theory, right? So they were the one who started supporting the theory of natural selection a lot, right? So we start calling them as Neo-Darwinists, scientists such as Haeckel, Huxley, and Simpson, right? So they started supporting the theory of natural selection which was given by Darwin. Later on, since there were a lot of objections pertaining to the theory which was given by Darwin, other scientists, right? Other scientists by name Fisher, second one Sewall Wright, and another scientist by name Mayer, right? So they started adding up, or they started making some sort of additional modification with regards to the natural selection theory which was given by Darwin, and they all came up with this particular theory called as the modern synthetic theory, or the theory of, they came up with this particular theory called the modern synthetic theory or the Neo-Darwinism, right? So they are all actually considered as supporters of Darwin's theory. Right. So these three scientists are actually considered as the strong supporters of theory of natural selection. But the other three scientists, Fisher, Sewall Wright, as well as Mayer, they started making some sort of modifications. So keeping the objections in view, objections pertaining to Darwin's theory in view, these three scientists, they started making some sort of modifications to the theory of natural selection. So they started adding some more points to the theory of natural selection to make it more acceptable. So therefore, these scientists are called as Neo-Darwinists, and the theory what they came up with is called as the modern synthetic theory, or it is also called as Neo-Darwinism. Right. Now, what does this theory state? As per these scientists whom we have seen so far, this modern synthetic theory or the Neo-Darwinism theory or the Neo-Darwinism states that there are 5 basic factors responsible for the process of evolution. Right? So they say that there are 5 basic factors responsible for the process of evolution. So we'll see what are those 5 basic factors one by one, and we'll see what actually did they say pertaining to this particular theory. So they said that there are 5 basic factors involved in the process of evolution. So the first factor, right? So the first factor is something called as gene mutation. So let me write down all the 5 factors, then we'll talk about each one in little detail. So the first factor, what they said, is the gene mutation, right? Second factor is the chromosome mutation. Chromosomal mutation. Right? So the third factor is genetic recombination. Genetic recombination. The fourth factor is natural selection. The fourth one is natural selection. And the fifth factor is reproductive. The fifth factor is reproductive isolation. Right? So these are the 5 factors which are responsible for the process of evolution. So as per the Neo-Darwinists, right? As per the Neo-Darwinists, so we saw the list of those scientists, right? Haeckel, Huxley, Simpson, Fisher, Mayer, Sewall, right? So they are all considered as Neo-Darwinists, right? So as per those scientists, that is Neo-Darwinists, they came up with this particular theory called as the modern synthetic theory. And as per the modern synthetic theory, what they say is there are 5 basic factors involved in the process of evolution, right? So there are 5 basic factors involved in the process of evolution. So what are those 5 basic factors? First one is gene mutation, chromosomal mutation, genetic recombination, natural selection, as well as reproductive isolation. So let us see what exactly are all these. So I hope we are all familiar with these terms, because several times we have spoken about each of these terms together, right? So quickly just refreshing what we know about each of this particular thing. So first, let us begin with gene mutation, right? So we have already spoken about gene mutation a lot when we were talking about the topic called as genetics, right? So in genetics, we spoke a lot about this point called as gene mutation. So when we made the classification of mutation, right? So we started classifying mutations into 2 categories. One is gene mutation and the other one is called chromosomal mutation. So there we saw everything in detail, right? Now, just to recollect those, what does gene mutation mean, right? Any sort of changes that occur in the gene that is present on the chromosome. That is what we call it as gene mutation, right? So any sort of changes that occur in the gene that is present on the chromosome, right? It could be either a point mutation, or it could be either frame shift mutation, right? We saw all those, right? So we saw about something called as deletion mutation, right? Substitution mutation, transversion mutation. So all that we have seen that, right? Now, what does the gene mutation result? Gene mutations would usually result in some sort of changes in the phenotype of an organism, right? Try to understand this. Gene mutation would result in some sort of changes in the phenotype of an organism, leading to some sort of variations. Now, as per these scientists again, those variations are now passed on from generation to generation, and over a period of time, the variations would be accumulated, leading to the evolution of new species. So the first factor that is involved in the process of evolution is this gene mutation. Second one, chromosomal mutation. So this also we have studied a lot regarding chromosomal mutation also. So what does chromosomal mutation mean, right? So mutations that occur in the chromosome, right? So we have discussed a lot of chromosomal mutations also. We spoke about something called as deletion, duplication, inversion, translocation. So all these are nothing but chromosomal mutation. So these chromosomal mutations, if you could recollect what we saw in the earlier classes, we said that chromosomal mutations would lead to 2 different kinds of things. One is either there is change in the structure of chromosome, or there is some sort of change in the number of chromosomes, right? So what the scientists again say is this chromosomal mutation would lead to some sort of physical variations, right? It would lead to some sort of phenotypic variations in a particular organism, which are again said to be inherited. Chromosomal mutation. The next thing what we have is genetic recombination. So we have already studied about this topic also, which is recombination. So what do we mean by recombination? Recombination is nothing but the process of exchange of genetic material between two non-sister chromatids of a homologous pair of chromosomes. This also we have studied when we were discussing about recombination and linkage in genetics topic, right? So you can just refer to those notes what we have already studied. So what does genetic recombination mean? It is nothing but the exchange of genetic material between two non-sister chromatids of a homologous pair of chromosomes. Now this gene recombination, we also call it as crossing over. And when does it occur? It usually occurs during meiotic cell division. Right. So during meiotic cell division, there is exchange of genetic material happening between the homologous pair of chromosomes. As a result of which, some sort of variations would be seen in that particular organism. And as per the scientists again, these variations are inherited from generation to generation. And over a period of time, those variations would be accumulated in a particular organism, right? Leading to the process of evolution. Right. So the first 3 points what we have seen here, that is gene mutation, chromosomal mutation, as well as genetic recombination. All of these three, right? All of these 3 points what we have seen here, right? It would lead to the variations in an organism, right? It would lead to some sort of variations in an organism, and these variations, which are caused either because of gene mutation or chromosomal mutation or genetic recombination, would now be inherited from generation to generation, leading to the evolution of a new species. This is what they say pertaining to these 3 factors. The fourth factors what they are talking about is the process called as natural selection. We have already spoken about this natural selection when we were talking about Darwin's theory. So the same natural selection is actually incorporated in this particular theory also, right? So what the scientists say pertaining to this particular point, that is natural selection, is unlike the first 3 factors, natural selection does not result in variations. Right? Try to understand this. Unlike gene mutation or chromosomal mutations or genetic recombination, right? Natural selection does not result in the production of variations, but what it does is through natural selection, the beneficial variations are selected by the nature, whereas harmful variations are being eliminated by the nature. Right? So what they say in this theory, in this natural selection point, they say that unlike gene mutation, chromosomal mutation, or genetic recombination, right, natural selection does not lead to variations, but what it does is it selects the beneficial variations by eliminating the harmful variations. Therefore, scientists started calling this natural selection as the driving force for they started calling it as the driving force for evolution. Right? It is considered as the driving force for evolution. Right? So the natural selection is actually considered as the driving force for evolution. Right? Next. Finally, moving to the last point, which is called reproductive isolation. Right? So reproductive isolation also we have already seen. Right? So reproductive isolation also we have already seen when we were discussing about Darwin's theory or Darwinism, the last point of Darwin's theory, last postulate of Darwin's theory. So what did he say in this reproductive isolation? So Darwin's theory said that regarding reproductive isolation, what he said is once beneficial variations are seen in the organism, right? Once beneficial variations are seen in the organism, those beneficial variations are passed on to successive generations. Right? So the beneficial variation seen in an organism is passed on from successive it is passed on to the successive generation, from generation to generation. And at one particular generation, there is this accumulation of variations happening. Right? There is this accumulation of variations happening. Now, due to this accumulation of variation, right? So due to accumulation of variations, what is happening? there is some sort of changes in an organism, right? There is some sort of changes in an organism. One such change in the organism is, I told you also this when we were discussing about Darwin's theory, right? One such change is this particular organism which has accumulated the variations will no longer be able to reproduce with any of these organisms present in its parental generations. Right? So what we said, this organism or this generation of organism which has accumulated the variations will no longer be able to interbreed with any of its parental generations or any of its parental forms. That type of organism which is not able to interbreed with any of its parental forms, we started calling it as reproductively isolated organism. Now that reproductively isolated organism would now lead to the evolution of a new species. That is what they also said, right? So reproductive isolation is the one which is responsible for the evolution of a new species, right? So these are the 5 different factors what these neo-Darwinists has given pertaining to the theory called as the modern synthetic theory or neo-Darwinism, right? So what did they say pertaining to the modern synthetic theory? First one, gene mutation. So what is this gene mutation? Any sort of changes that occur in the gene of that gene that is located on the chromosome. Gene mutation. So this gene mutation would lead to some sort of phenotypic variations in an organism, which would lead to, which are actually inherited from generation to generation, leading to the evolution of a new species. Similarly, chromosomal mutation also. So what they said in chromosomal mutation, any changes that occur in the chromosomes, right? They call it as chromosomal mutation. These chromosomal mutations also would lead to some sort of variations in an organism. Now these variations are passed on from generation to generation, leading to the evolution of a new species. Genetic recombination, exchange of genetic material between homologous chromosomes, non-sister chromatids of a homologous pair of chromosomes, right? Again, this genetic recombination also would lead to some sort of variations in an organism, and these variations are inherited from generation to generation, leading to the evolution of a new species. Fourth one, natural selection. They said that unlike gene mutation, chromosomal mutations or genetic recombination, natural selection does not lead to any sort of variations, but through natural selection, beneficial mutations are or beneficial variations are selected by the nature, whereas the harmful variations are eliminated by the nature. Therefore, natural selection is considered as the driving force for evolution because it selects only the beneficial variations in an organism. And finally, reproductive isolation, right? So due to accumulation of variations in a particular organism, there would be some sort of changes in an organism, and one such change is these organisms will no longer be able to interbreed with any of its parental types. As a result of which we start calling it as reproductively isolated organism, and such reproductively isolated organism would lead to the evolution of a new species. That is what is reproductive isolation, right? So 5 different factors, or rather 5 factors which are actually responsible for the process of evolution as per the modern synthetic theory or the neo-Darwinism. Right? So this is our 4th theory what we have. So with this, we are almost done with our topic called the theories of evolution. So 4 theories we have taken up so far. One is the Lamarck's theory, which was given by Lamarck. Second one, Darwin's theory. The third one, mutation theory by Hugo de Vries. And the last one, modern synthetic theory or neo-Darwinism, right? Which were given by supporters of Darwin, right? So they started explaining or elaborating the theory of natural selection, making it more acceptable to the scientists, right? So this is what we have with the process of evolution, or rather the theories of evolution, right? So we'll stop here for today. In the next session, we'll take up with the mechanism of evolution, right? The origin of variations, as well as the inheritance pattern, as well as the formation of new species. So we'll be talking about the mechanism of evolution in the next lectures. Fine.